Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, I'll be doing an updated map of the United States Senate and showing you my prediction for these upcoming November elections. It's been over a month since I last did one of these, and my thoughts on a few of these races have changed. And I also think that this is the first time I've done a Senate map since the Democratic Party switched from likely nominating Joe Biden to now likely nominating Kamala Harris. So let's talk about it. We're going to start, as we always do, by filling out the states that are going to be safe for the Democrats. These states are going to be Washington, California, Hawaii, New Mexico, Minnesota, now in that column. Normally, Minnesota is traditionally not a safe Democratic state, but with Amy Klobuchar running for re-election, she typically overperforms by a lot. She leads by over 20 points in most polls. I feel comfortable putting that in the safe column. Similar thing in Virginia, where the polls are pretty good for Tim Kaine. Delaware, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, and Maine. Obviously, in Vermont and Maine, the two people likely to win are Bernie Sanders and Angus King, both of whom are independents, but they caucus with Democrats. These are functionally seats Democrats hold. Now, for the Republicans, they're going to win Wyoming, Utah, both seats in Nebraska, although it is interesting the Democrats in one of these seats in the, not the special, so in the bigger seat on your map here, they are not running a candidate. They're likely to back an independent. They say they're looking for a write-in candidate, but really what they're going to do is not do anything, and most Democrats are going to vote for the independent, who is a former Democrat anyways, and will likely make some sort of deal with the state party. That'll make the race interesting. It will not be competitive. This is a safe red state. North Dakota, Missouri, we'll talk a little bit more about. Tennessee, Mississippi, Indiana, and then, of course, West Virginia is going to be the first pickup of the night for Republicans. Joe Manchin, the Democrat who holds that seat, not running for re-election. It's a safe red state. Republicans are going to pick it up. Missouri, I think, in terms of margin, could be likely. I'll leave it there for now because I want to do this by margin so you can see what the map will look like at the end. Josh Hawley, I believe, is likely to underperform Trump by a handful of points. So if Trump wins the state by 15 or 16 or 17, Hawley could win by 9 or 10 or 11. He's not in danger of losing his re-election bid, but he will underperform Trump. So that leaves Democrats 42 solid seats, Republicans 48. So if you think Trump's going to win the presidency, Republicans only need to win 2 more seats. And they can do that. There's 4 Trump states from 2020 still on the board. Even so, if you think Harris is going to win the presidency, he needs 3. The Republicans need 3 seats to win back the majority. Again, 4 Trump states from 2020. So this should not be too difficult for them. They have a very good map up this cycle. But are they going to be able to finish the job? We'll talk about it now. So we're going to go back to the Democratic column. Likely Democratic states. A state that's going to be joining this column is Nevada. Nevada is usually not a state that I like to put in the likely Democratic column. In fact, if you watched me back in 2020 when the polls had Biden up by 5-6 points here, I said the state was going to be very close. I said about a 2 or 3 point win for Biden on election day. He won by just between those 2 numbers. But this is the first time I feel genuinely very comfortable in Democratic chances in Nevada in any federal statewide race. The reason why is you can look at the polls. And the polling, obviously, it's still August. Things can tighten, and if they do, I'll move it. But right now, latest polls, NYT Siena, one of the best pollsters in the country. Rosen, she's up by 9 there. She's up by 3 in Redfield and Wilton, but a lot of undecideds. She was up by 18 in a poll done by the Cook Political Report. Mind you, this poll had Donald Trump winning the state, but had Rosen up 18. So they think there's a lot of people voting for Trump in Nevada who are voting Democratic for U.S. Senate. Then you go, Redfield and Wilton had her up by 5. Then she was up by 4. So this pollster's done a lot of Nevada Senate polls. Then finally, there's other polls like from Emerson back in June that had her up by 12. So she leads by a lot in most cases. And you can kind of see why. She's a relatively popular incumbent senator. She won in 2018 by 6 points against a Republican incumbent. And if you look at the fundraising, if you look at kind of how she's spending compared to her opponent, Sam Brown, let's take a look at this Senate race. She has $9.5 million in terms of cash on hand. Sam Brown, her opponent, has 3 times less than her. She's outspent him $22 million to $6 million. This race is looking very difficult for Republicans. They're getting outspent. They're down double digits in most polls, and they can win the majority in a lot of ways. I think we can expect Nevada to realistically be off the board for Republicans within the next month. So Democrats hold on to that seat, which is important for them, but they still have a long way to go. We're now going to go over to Wisconsin. Now, Wisconsin is a state that I debated putting in lean. I could see myself moving it if the polls tighten before Election Day. But if we take a look at the polls, we can see that Tammy Baldwin is not in a particularly close race. Now, let's look at the latest polling data we have. So this tip poll sponsored by American Greatness, she's up by 8. She's up by 9 in the Bullfinch group. NYT Siena, as you all know, I'm a big fan of that pollster. She's up by 7. She's up by 7 in the Cook Political Report poll, the same one that polled Rosen. And again, she's up by 7 when Biden is, I think, narrowly winning the state. I think only by 1 or 2. Marquette, local pollster, she's up by 7 there. So she's consistently up by 7, 8, 9 points, high single digits. And again, this is an incumbent who won by 11 points in 2018. If you look at the fundraising, you look at the data, how much she's spending compared to her opponent, Eric Hovde, who is the Republican challenger who recently won his primary. She spent $26 million. He spent $11 million. Now, the cash on hand discrepancy is a bit smaller, but again, so far she's raised more money than him, and that will likely continue to expand. We also have to consider that even though primary turnout data is not a very good indicator of predicting the general election, this was the first time in a very long time that is the first time in a really a good amount of election cycles where Democrats outvoted the Republicans when they didn't have a competitive primary. Republicans did have a competitive primary. So Wisconsin this year, I think Trump could very well win the state, but in that Senate race, Tammy Baldwin, who outran Tony Evers in 2018 by 10 points, we could see a similar scenario. If Trump wins Wisconsin by a point or 2, Baldwin could easily win by 4 or 5. I think for that reason, this is going to be maybe a 5-6 point victory for Tammy Baldwin. We're now going to go to the state of Maryland. Maryland is, to me, a borderline safe state, but I do want to talk about it because it is interesting. We don't have a ton of polling here. What we do know is that in the latest poll, Angela Also Brooks led Larry Hogan by 8 points, and then when you don't push undecided, she's up by 11. What's interesting to me is that in this race, the last time we got a poll was when Kamala Harris, or when Joe Biden was not the Democratic nominee. Now that Kamala Harris is the nominee, I think that really helps Democratic turnout in states like Maryland. And so the path for Larry Hogan in the past might have somehow been to hope Democratic turnout's really bad for Joe Biden. Kamala Harris has, I think, re-energized a lot of that base. And with that, Hogan, his chances have gone down. You also have to consider that in these polls, a lot of Hogan's support is soft. Again, comparing where he is in the polls when you don't push undecideds, he's at 34%, and then he's at 38%. So, again, I think there are a lot of Marylanders who like him. He was a popular governor of that state for 8 years, but they might not vote for him for Senate. Again, governors who run for Senate in states that you vote the other way usually don't do well. In 2020, Steve Bullock was the popular governor of Montana for 8 years. He ran for Senate and lost by 10. So there are a lot of voters in Montana who are fine with the Democrat for governor, didn't want them in Washington. That might be a problem for Tester later in this video. We'll see. But in Maryland, again, a lot of Marylanders might like Larry Hogan. They might have liked him as their governor. They don't want another Republican vote in the Senate because this is a very blue state. So that's going to do it for the likely Democratic states. We're going to go to our likely Republican states now. I'm only going to put one in this column at this point. It's going to be Florida. So Florida, what's interesting is that we have gotten a couple polls that have shown it kind of close. But again, you have to consider how the 2020 polls looked. So right now, Rick Scott, latest poll, he's up by 4. He's up by 10, although this is a GOP poll. He's up by 4 in the 2 latest nonpartisan polls. And then he was actually up by 2 when you pushed undecideds, but that was back in June. So in the past few polls, he's led by 4. But again, in 2020, the polls underestimated Trump by nearly 5% here. You also have to remember, by more than that, I think nearly 6% here. And you also have to remember that in 2022, the polls across the Senate, pretty universally underestimated Democratic support, right? Like the polls had Fetterman losing, they had Warnock losing, they had Cortez Masto losing. Marco Rubio outran his polls by like 7 points. So this is a state where Democrats have not done well compared to their polling, even in 2022, when the polls are broadly good for Democrats across the board. And in the primary vote data, again, not big fan of using primary vote data to forecast future elections, but we do know Democratic turnout is massively down across the state of Florida. Republicans have been registering a ton of new voters. The state is clearly trending a certain way. I don't see how Debbie Merkel-Powell can reverse 6, 8, 10 years of GOP favorable trends. I think the state stays red by more than people think. So we're now going to go to our competitive states here. We have kind of a map here: Montana, Arizona, Texas, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania. They're all kind of on the board for both parties. Now, the first state that I want to talk about is Arizona. So Arizona, I debated putting the state in likely because the polls are atrocious for Republicans when you look right now. New York Times Siena, Ruben Gallego up by 9. In this GOP-sponsored poll, he's up by 2. Another GOP-sponsored poll, it's tied, but in high ground, Gallego's up by 11. He's up by 6 in Redfield and Wilton. In the Cook Political Report-sponsored poll, he's up by 9. So the GOP polls have him tied and narrowly ahead, and nonpartisan polls have him up by a lot. And again, let's talk about the spending here, because this is going to play a big role in it. As of right now, in this Senate race, as you can see, cash on hand, it's a big advantage for Gallego. $9.2 million for him, $2.8 million for Kari Lake. Again, you look at the amount that they've raised. He's raised $31 million. She's only raised $10 million. I think the money's with Democrats here. The polls are with them. The momentum's with them. New York Times Siena not only has Gallego winning, but has Harris winning the state by 5 points. I'm not saying I believe that, but the polls clearly favor a certain party here. And Kari Lake is just very unpopular. She lost in 2022. That was the governor's race that was very winnable for Republicans. And now she's losing by a lot more in 2024. I think this is a 4 to 5 point Democratic victory at this point. Pennsylvania is similar. You could put the state in the likely column. I'm not going to do that just yet because I do think that there has been a bit of tightening in the polls. And again, not too substantially, but if you look at if you look at how Bob Casey's doing, latest polls, he's up by 4. This is a GOP poll, but he's still up by 4. Emerson had him up by 5. He's up by 8 in Quinnipiac, and then Bullfinch had him up by 12. And NYT Siena, which is really good for him, he's up by 14. So that poll is amazing for him. But in the past few polls, it's been down to mid to low single digits. I think just to play it safe, we'll put it in lean. You also have to remember that David McCormick, who's his GOP opponent, has the ability to self-fund. A lot of money is going to be pouring in this race for Republicans. I think they view this as a better pickup opportunity than, say Arizona or Nevada or Wisconsin, maybe even Michigan. We'll talk about that in just 1 minute here. But Pennsylvania, to me, competitive, but Democrats are clearly the favorites here, especially with a popular incumbent like Bob Casey, who won by 12 points in 2018. Michigan, this is an open seat. Republicans have a real shot to pick this up. And unlike, I'd say, in Wisconsin or Arizona, they did not hinder the chances by nominating what I would call to be an unelectable candidate, right? Like in Arizona, they ran Kari Lake, who is, an election denier. I think that's a very unpopular stance to take, even in a state like Arizona where Republicans have historically done well, although, again, Biden won it in 2020. So, and then in Wisconsin, Eric Hovde is a more, I wouldn't say super right-wing candidate, but he has, expressed a lot of things that I think are out of line with the average Wisconsin voter, pretty moderate. You also have to remember that Eric Hovde has never won elected office before, so he doesn't have the political experience that Republicans would have benefited from had they run a former congressman or maybe a former statewide official. But Michigan, Mike Rogers here is polling decently. He hasn't, done that well. It's not amazing for Republicans, and I don't think he's, a great candidate, but he's been close in a handful of polls, right? Like NYT Siena only has him down by 3, which is a pretty good sign for him. He's only down by 3 in Fabrizio and Lee, but again, it's a GOP poll. He's down by 10 in this Bullfinch group poll, but again, they've been pretty favorable to Democrats this cycle. He's down by 8 in the Cook Political Report poll, and then he's down by 5 in Glen Griff, which is a local poll. Then he's down by 5 in the Fox poll. So he's kind of been all over the place. I'm going to put it in lean. The thing about Michigan this year is that it kind of comes down to how well Trump does, because Trump has historically done pretty well in Michigan. Even in 2020, when he was down to basically every poll on election day, he came within 3 points of winning it. So if we get another Trump performance here, and maybe he even wins it or comes within a point of doing so, this race is on the board. But on the other hand, most polls have showed Elisa Slotkin outrunning Kamala Harris, and Mike Rogers, while a good candidate, does actually poll worse than Trump for whatever reason. I think there's still some working class voters who, like Democrats down ballot, but want to vote for Trump this year. So we'll see how that turns out. This is an interesting race. I'd be interested in, getting more polls from it, and I'd like to move it, I think, potentially down to toss-up if we do get more information. But at this point in time, I think there's a clear advantage for Democrats here, even though we need to see more. So Democrats, 48 seats, Republicans, 49. But we're now going to get into territory where Republicans could win the majority. The final 3 states on your map here, Montana, Texas, and Ohio, I'm going to take you through them. The good news for Republicans is that they're all Trump states. The bad news for Republicans is that in 2 of these 3 states, the Democrats are the incumbent party. So we're going to start in Montana. And Montana, even though Democrats are the incumbent party, they're going to have a very difficult time holding it. John Tester has won in 2006. He's won in 2012. He's won in 2018. Right now, I am pretty confident that he's an underdog. Doesn't mean he can't win, but I think that it's very hard to make an argument for him being favored. Let's look at the polls. Now, the good news for Tester is that he got a very good poll from RMG Research. He was up by 5 in this poll, but in other polls, it's not good. Again, local poll, down by 6, down by 2 in Emerson. GOP-sponsored poll, down by 5. Another GOP-sponsored poll, down by 6. So in 4 of the last 5 polls, Tester's losing. And again, this is a state where polls have historically underestimated Republican support. Last time there was a Senate race in Montana, it was 2020. A lot of people, including myself, I'll admit that, thought the race was going to be very competitive because the polls were so close and because Steve Bullock was so popular in that state. It was not close. It was not close at all. Steve Bullock lost by 10, and Democrats haven't really competed here since then. John Tester is going to put up a big fight. He's a well-liked incumbent. His favorables are still very high. His approval rating is still very high. But Republicans are going to keep attacking him. Donald Trump was there just, I think, a week and a half ago. And Republicans in 2018 came really close to knocking off Tester in a blue wave midterm year that was less polarized. It's a presidential year. Trump's on the ballot. It's going to be, redder than 2018. Again, even if you think Kamala Harris is going to win the election, it's not going to be a D+9 year. At this point, it's very hard to see a path for Tester winning re-election that doesn't rely on something strange happening between now and November. Doesn't mean it's over. He's a well-liked incumbent senator. He's won in a red state 3 times before. Don't count him out. But right now, it's pretty clear to me he is the underdog, and by a good amount. So put this in the lean Republican column. Now, Republicans, if they win Texas or Ohio, get the majority. The good news for them is that I'm going to give them Texas here. So Texas, let's talk about Texas. This is a state that the GOP, I think, should be ahead by Moreno. Colin, Allred, who's the Democratic nominee, has not been running a very dynamic campaign. He's done kind of the bare minimum of, running a few TV ads, doing a few rallies. But he hasn't really fundraised even close to as much as Beto O'Rourke raised in 2018. And again, if you look at the funds, in 2018, Beto O'Rourke raised a lot of money. That's why he was able to go toe-to-toe with Ted Cruz in that way. This year, if we look at this Senate race and we look at how much cash on hand the candidates have, Ted Cruz has more money than Colin Allred to spend on this race. And Democrats have, in most competitive Senate races, typically enjoy an advantage because they have a more dynamic fundraising base than the GOP does. In this case, Ted Cruz has more cash to spend than Colin Allred does. And again, Colin Allred has been outspent on TV by nearly $18 million. That's not good for him at all. It means that Ted Cruz is kind of, not dominating, but he has, the majority of stuff on the airwaves is in favor of him or against Allred. And early on in a race in a state like Texas that is still pretty Republican-leaning, you've got to define your opponent. That's what Ted Cruz is likely doing. This has been a kind of a calmer race that a lot of people expected. Ted Cruz, a lot of Democrats nationwide don't like him, so you kind of expect Colin Allred to be fundraising off that. He hasn't been able to do that yet. That's a concern for him. Now, the good news is that Ted Cruz's favorables aren't great. They're not bad. I don't think he's that unpopular of a senator within Texas, but they're not good either. So a lot of Texans don't like him. If Colin Allred can get those people to, vote for him and he can, get some crossover support in the suburbs, he can win this race. Realistically, we haven't seen that yet. If we look at the polls, they've been kind of close, but, they haven't really shown any indication of this state being close to flipping. Ted Cruz up by 8 in active vote GOP poll, but he's up by 10. YouGov from the UH Hobby School, which is a great local Texas pollster. The people that I know who cover Texas politics really like this pollster, so Cruz only being up by 3, I think, is not good for him. But again, that was back in June. We need more polling data on this state. I really want more polls. So Texas, to me, this is a state that's going to be close. I think it's going to be under 5 points. I don't see a path for Colin Allred that, again, doesn't involve something changing between now and November. Doesn't mean it's not possible, but I think right now, based on the polls we have, based on the fact that he's getting outspent and the fact that Ted Cruz is dominating the airwaves and is an incumbent who won in a bluer year in 2018, all those factors to me make it pretty likely Ted Cruz does win re-election, even if the margin isn't as big as some people think it could be. So now Ohio. This is a state where I've been pretty confident on Republicans in, but you know what? For now, I'm going to flip it back to the Democrats. I'm going to put it in the tilt Democratic column. So the reason that I've been confident in Republicans here is that I've always said Trump's going to win the state by 8, 9, maybe 10 points, which I still stand by, even against Kamala Harris, who's stronger than Joe Biden. What I do think has changed is that the polls have not changed at all against Sherrod Brown. I thought by June, July, once Republicans got their primary done, they'd be ready to just attack Sherrod Brown, right? Bernie Moreno, unite behind him, start defining Sherrod Brown, right? Because Sherrod Brown is a very progressive Democratic senator. He is not, speaking truthfully, particularly, and I'm not saying this as an endorsement of Moreno, but I'm saying, realistically, he's a progressive Democrat in a red state. Ohio's not even a purple state anymore. This is a red state we're talking about. And so if you look at the polls, they don't reflect that. Ohioans still like Sherrod Brown. His approval ratings is still very high. And in the latest polls, active vote, he's up by 5. He's up by 4 in Fabrizio, which is Donald Trump's pollster, so they have him up by 4. Another GOP poll, Remington, sponsored by this super PAC for the Republicans. Brown's up by 6. He's up by 5 in Marist, which is a good poll that I like. NPA has him up by 8, and then, go to the polls from earlier, he's up by even more. FAU had him up by 12 back in March. So every poll, Moreno hasn't been close. And again, let's talk about the ads and the TV spending, because it is horrible for Republicans here. We actually got news last week that Republicans canceled an ad buy in Ohio, and a lot of people are saying that's a sign they're giving up on Moreno. I don't think they're giving up Moreno this early. That would be a bad decision for them, in my opinion. But if we take a look at the spending here, it's bad for Bernie Moreno. Sherrod Brown has raised $51 million. He's raised $15 million. Sherrod Brown spent $42 million. Bernie Moreno spent $11 million. Again, cash on hand, Sherrod Brown $11 million. Bernie Moreno a little over $4 million. So at this point, I could definitely see this race coming back to Republicans. They have an advantage in that Ohio is a red state. If Donald Trump can get his voters to back Bernie Moreno will win. The problem is that no polls have shown any indication of that. Sherrod Brown holds on to a lot of his support, even among Trump voters. And again, we've seen polls where Trump's up by 10 in Ohio, and Sherrod Brown still leads by 6-7 points. So this state, for whatever reason, still really likes Sherrod Brown, even though obviously this is an increasingly Republican and conservative state. So there you have it. As of right now, Democrats 49 seats, Republicans 51. So again, this chamber is close because it's any 59 or any 51-49 race is close, but Democrats have an uphill battle because on top of them having to win Ohio, which is functionally a toss-up at this point, they're going to have to win one of Montana or Texas, and that's just for a tie. If Trump wins the election, they have to win both Montana and Texas, which is possible. It's not out of the realm of possibility by any means, but it's very difficult, and it's not an outcome I'd bet on. It's more likely Republicans get to 53 or 54 seats than Democrats do get to 51 seats, in my opinion. So again, let me know what you think. Let me know if there's any races you disagree with me on. We'll talk about it more. Again, please subscribe. We're so close to 10,000 subscribers. We've been growing a lot in the past few days. I really appreciate it. Channel has been doing great. I have you all to thank for that. So again, comment down what you want to see next. Comment down your thoughts, and I'll see you all the next one.